I think that anxiety has often been dismissed as something that's not as serious as other mental health illnesses like depression, like suicide, like psychosis. But what was really clear for me as a researcher stepping out of the interviews with the young men that I was talking to about their anxiety experiences was the very clear impact that anxiety was having on their lives. The role of masculinity in anxiety was an area of interest for me with my research. What was clear was that a perceived inability to live up to the masculine standards that they felt might socially be expected of them, they felt like was tied to their anxiety symptoms. A big part of what I learned, and I try to encourage other women in men's lives, is that you don't have to have all the answers, especially with anxiety. I think as much as you can, just trying to be the non-judgmental, caring person in a man's life, and sometimes just being there is enough.
Dr. Krista Fischer, welcome to The Meaning of Men. How would you, in a few sentences, describe the mission that you're on?
The mission that I'm on? Wow, that is a great question. I think, well, me as a researcher, my mission and what really drew me to the space in young men's mental health specifically is to try to understand some of the unique experiences that young men go through in terms of their mental health challenges and to bring better visibility to that. So if I was to summarize that and really hone in on what my mission is, it's to not only understand, but also to bring better visibility to those challenges and hopefully allow others to learn from that and to have better experiences in terms of their mental health.
Give me a bit more of a sense of who you are and what led you to what you're doing today. And for people that are listening that have probably heard of Movember but might not be that familiar with the work that you do, give us a bit of a flavour of that too.
So who I am a research fellow at Movember. And as a researcher, I spend a lot of time in the data and writing up papers and using the insights that we galvanise from that, from speaking to men, from speaking to people in their communities, and from looking at numbers really related to their health outcomes, using that to then dispel knowledge to other people. And Movember more broadly is a global men's health charity. For anyone who doesn't know, a big part of what we do is raise money through, initially started as growing mustaches and encouraging people to fundraise and start conversations through that mode of a mustache, and really bringing better conversations and opportunities to connect with other men about men's health challenges. And what started as a relatively small kind of campaign in Melbourne, started by 3 guys at a pub in Brunswick, has now grown to a $1 billion charity. So we've raised over $1.6 billion over 21 years, and it's much more than just a fundraising campaign. Now we fund incredible research, which I'm a part of, but also help to galvanise other community or grassroots organisations and programs that are set up to be a space for promoting better health amongst men. And also now we have a whole range of advocacy and policy efforts where we're working very closely with government to start to translate the research insights and conversations that we're having with men on the ground into real life, practical, implementable policy changes.
We're going to be focusing a lot of our conversations today around anxiety, and it's interesting to me because it's definitely something that I'm hearing a lot more now in men than maybe I did 5 or 10 years ago, like more of my friends or more friends of friends talking more openly about anxiety. So it's going to be really interesting to dive into what it means, what the implications are, and how men can hopefully better manage anxiety if they're going through that. Why for you is it such a big topic? Because you've done a lot of research into it. You've written some great papers, some of which we're going to be going to later. Why is it such an important topic for you?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It is a really important topic, and I think it's great to see the change around conversations and awareness of men's anxiety, even your anecdotal reflection there that more of your friends are talking about it, that it's becoming more of a issue that is spoken about and that there is more awareness around. If I think about 4 years ago when I started my PhD and my research journey and selected very purposefully to focus in on men's anxiety, it was because there was such a gap in the field of men's mental health where we had done a lot of work and focused a lot of our efforts on better understanding and challenging stigma that surrounded men's depression and suicidality, which are incredibly important issues and areas that we needed to focus on. But for me, when I was looking at the data and became aware of how prevalent anxiety disorders were, the fact that anxiety disorders are the number one mental health challenge that men are diagnosed with globally, yet I didn't see any unique or tailored research and programs that were focusing in on the very distinct and unique aspects of anxiety. I felt like it was a really ripe and important avenue for future research and better kind of understanding and education around.
I want to take a step back and if you were explaining this in very simplistic terms, what exactly is anxiety, and how would I know as a man if I might be struggling at some level with it?
So, anxiety is both an emotion and it can be a pathologized mental health illness. So, it can be diagnosed by clinicians. Very simply, anxiety is like a fear or worry response, but it's a normal part of human evolution and day to day experiences. It keeps us safe in a number of ways. We need to have those anxious, fearful, or worry responses. And sometimes that can be, you might be ruminating on something, so it could feel a bit more like thought spirals, or it could be very physical type experiences. So it might be sweaty palms or butterflies in your stomach, shaking, jittering, stuttering sometimes in your words. And when we talk about anxiety disorders, what that typically looks like is when the symptoms start to impact an individual's functioning. So that could be in their social functioning, the way that they might connect with other people in their lives, their occupational functioning or their vocational functioning, so at school. So it's when it meets a threshold that it's starting to impact negatively someone's day-to-day experiences. That's how I would very simply distill what anxiety is. I would say as a man, the moment in which you might realise that what you're experiencing is anxiety can sometimes be a very difficult journey to go down. With my research, one of the big things that I did, big projects that I did, was speak to 30 young men who had been diagnosed with anxiety, what the onset of those symptoms and their pathways through to help services looked like. And the resounding story that I was told and the resounding similarity in terms of their experiences was that for so many of them, there were often multiple year-long journeys in which they had to kind of come to terms with the fact that what they were experiencing was actually anxiety. And that was for a number of reasons that I'm sure we will get into.
Yeah, and it's like you were saying, a lot of these emotions are hardwired into us, and they're hardwired into us for a very good reason. Obviously, going back to, I guess, hunter-gatherer days around survival. But as you were saying there, I suppose it's when it reaches a certain threshold and it's becoming detrimental to our every day-to-day lives is where we might need to start thinking about it and start to see how we can better manage it. Do these symptoms tend to differ between men and women? Does anxiety look different between different genders?
Yeah, so research does suggest that there are some differences, that some men may experience relative to some women. So when we take a look very broadly at some of our population-based research that we've got, so a lot of that has come from giving men and women anxiety surveys related to their symptoms to complete and comparing their different levels of symptoms at, as I said, a population-based level. So what we can see from that is that men are more likely to report physical anxiety symptoms. And that was something that also came up in the interviews that I conducted with young men in particular, where for a lot of them, the initial symptoms that they were experiencing was like a physical embodiment of distress. So what happened there was that there can be a disconnection sometimes between what a man might be experiencing in terms of those physical symptoms and what they might think anxiety looks like. And that's not only just down to the symptoms or emotional experience, but also sometimes the stereotypes that surround an illness. So particularly for something like anxiety, traditionally it's been more of a feminized mental health condition. If we, as you said, circle back to the hunter-gatherer days, but also back to the times of when our awareness and the field of psychology even started to come about. It was a very male-dominated industry or area, and a lot of the focus was kind of on the neurotic type symptoms that could be displayed. And a lot of the time that was more focused on women. And when we, it's really important to sometimes circle back and look at the history which has led to the stereotypes that surround not only certain illnesses, but also what we might consider patients or sufferers of those illnesses to look like. And whilst we've changed in a number of ways and decades of social change has helped to challenge some of those stereotypes, we only need to look at stereotypes around like gender, for example, that still remains very dominant and pervasive in our society.
I definitely see a pattern emerging in the conversations that I have around emotions and how men process and how that shows up with men. So I was having a conversation around grief, and the conversation was very much around men will grieve through doing, generally speaking, rather than sitting down one-to-one and talking. They'll grieve through actions rather than words. And then also like talking about like friendships as well. Male friends tend to like to go out and do things maybe rather than sit down and talk and process. And what you were talking there around anxiety, again, it's this physical manifestation that you see with it.
So I would definitely agree about the importance of considering that to make sense of a man's experience of anxiety. And the point that you touched around the men's expressions of grief through doing, another really interesting part of the research in anxiety that I uncovered was also men's inclination to try to manage anxiety through problem-based coping. And that was another sex differences finding that emerged through research, is that for women in our population-based data set research, what was uncovered was that they were more likely to report emotion-based coping strategies. And the definition of those two, when we're talking about problem-based coping strategies, that looks like trying to, in the context of anxiety, solve or alleviate the worry or problem that someone might be experiencing. So it's looking for solutions, it's trying to actively solve and alleviate those anxious or stressful sentiments as they arise. Whereas emotion-based coping strategies, what that tends to look like is seeking out through social supports, comfort and emotional support to actually help sit with and alleviate the emotion as it arises. So it's more so looking for the comfort and the soothing versus the solution to the problem.
In the paper, you say that anxiety in men is often overlooked with regards to mental health discussions. And I'm wondering, from what you just said there, is part of that because men don't tend to verbalize it in the same way that women do, and so it's not maybe looked at or diagnosed in the same way, or are there more things going on there as well?
Mm. It's very multifaceted. There is one component of that where we know that men over the last few decades have had lower rates of help seeking. We're actually seeing those rates between men and women start to equalise somewhat for mental health help seeking, which is a really wonderful result of increased discussions around mental health in our public discourse, and stigma hopefully starting to be minimised in that context. But there's also, especially with anxiety, another part to this whereby to receive a diagnosis of anxiety, the clinician themselves has to be able to pick up or link the symptoms that a man might be presenting with in a clinical room to the very kind of strict criteria that is met to diagnose an anxiety disorder. So I like to think that clinicians are absolutely able to have a very individualised approach to clinical treatment and to therapy. But when we're talking about, for example, the increased rates of physical symptoms, that is a really important part of a clinician's education that's needed around men's anxiety, and even understanding that a man might present differently with anxiety and not even have the words necessarily, awareness or understanding to be able to link those symptoms and experiences to a conceptualization of anxiety, for example. So it's that part around the clinician actually needing to be able to detect and pick up those symptoms and link that man who might be presenting in their clinical room to accurate treatment and resources and interventions. Another big part of this is the fact that we need to make sure that when men are diagnosed, that we have interventions and resources to point them to that's going to be able to support them in a way that not only helps them understand and link those symptoms that they're experiencing to anxiety, to start to learn about what anxiety is, but also to give them coping strategies and management strategies that are actually going to be able to work, that they feel like they can implement into their everyday lives.
You started to touch on it a little bit earlier, but I'd like to go into it in a bit more detail. What impact can high levels of anxiety have on a man on a day-to-day basis? And sort of expanding from that, from your experience, at what point will it take for a man to actually recognize it in themselves and seek help?
Mm. So the first point there around what impact it can have on a man's life, there's certainly a spectrum of impacts that anxiety can have. But traditionally, what's been really interesting is to see the way that there can be a dismissal of anxiety in the context of other psychiatric illnesses. So I think that anxiety has often been dismissed as something that's not as serious as other mental health illnesses like depression, like suicide, like psychosis. But what was really clear for me, even personally as a researcher, stepping out of the interviews with the young men that I was talking to about their anxiety experiences, was the very clear impact that anxiety was having on their lives. Whilst other mental health illnesses that they might have been experiencing certainly needed treatment and accurate kind of to be dealt with, the anxiety was the thing that they felt kept coming up and wasn't able to be properly addressed. And that was the thing that was making social connections with men, for example, or anyone else in their life so difficult, that then that ultimately left them with feelings of social isolation, that they were struggling at work, at school even, to get ahead. So it can have a really compounding impact where it might start as something small, like it could be initially experiencing anxiety symptoms speaking in front of a class, and that may not necessarily have that much of an impact, but over years and years of that being built up and starting to lose vital opportunities to connect with other people in their lives, or a sense of self-confidence to feel comfortable going into work, school, social situations, it can be really debilitating. And that's more broadly in a holistic sense of how it can impact someone's well-being and flourishing, but physically as well. When I was talking about the specific clinical symptoms that they're experiencing, for some of them it escalated all the way through to nausea and vomiting or body tremors. So the idea that it's not that serious, or that it could be dismissed as something that everyone experiences. Everyone's been anxious. Sure, but there are very different extremes when we are talking about, that threshold at which it becomes an anxiety disorder.
This might be a silly question, but as you were talking there, I was trying to work it out in my head. Is there a difference between being anxious and anxiety? Because like you said, day to day, if I think about my typical day, I'm anxious about getting the kids to school and nursery on time. I'm anxious about getting my work done. There are so many things I'm anxious about, but I wouldn't say that I suffer from anxiety. Are they two quite different things?
I would say the difference probably comes back to the emotion of anxiety versus the anxiety disorder, rather than anxious versus anxiety. In that description, potentially, anxiety is being conflated with anxiety disorders. So yeah, I would say that there is that distinction there. But you're right, the anxious emotions and thoughts, they do absolutely come and go for everyone.
Before we dive back into the episode, if you're enjoying these conversations, please do hit that subscribe button and leave a review. These two actions really make a huge difference and help the show reach more people who can benefit from these discussions. Let's keep building this community together. Thanks for being part of it. Back to the episode. In your research, you talk about plural masculinities, and I found that really, really interesting. Can you explain what this concept is and how it impacts anxiety?
Yeah, sure. So I described a little bit the process of gender socialization. Now, if we're orienting to masculinity specifically, we'd be talking about those typically westernized expressions of anxiety being the expectation that men are the providers, that they're strong, stoic, independent, tough. And when we're talking about the plurality of masculinities, what that starts to tap into is a better understanding about the different embodiment of masculinities, especially in this time. The strength, stoicism, independence, that can be more of what we might define as a traditional expression of anxiety, that they're the long-standing gold kind of markers of what what manhood and masculinity might look like, but they're intersectional ways in which masculinity is expressed and socialized that takes into consideration a man's sexual identity, their age, their culture. So it gets at the different ways in which masculinity can be expressed and the ways in which it's manifested in different social contexts and individual contexts as well. So the role of masculinity and in anxiety was an area of interest for me with my research. What I wanted to understand is how masculinity can play a role for men, and how I best define that as is the cyclical relationship that was becoming more and more clear to me, not only through summarising past work that had been done and past research that had been done, but also speaking with young men themselves about how they feel like their gender as a man might impact, if it does at all, their experiences of anxiety. And so what was clear was that the gendered expectations around masculinity could create extra anxieties for men, that conflict often between a perceived inability to live up to the masculine standards that they felt they should, or what might socially be expected of them, could often result, or they felt like was tied to their anxiety symptoms. Yet what also happened was that as young men's anxiety symptoms started to become more and more of an issue for them, they felt like that was actually having a cost to their masculine identity. So the conceptualization of anxiety potentially being more of a feminized experience, what I called a perceived invisibility of anxiety in men in their lives, so that they would describe to me about the impact of not seeing their dads, their brothers, their coaches in their lives ever experiencing anxiety. They felt like it was potentially something wrong with them, that was something that they shouldn't be experiencing, that it was because of their own failure, that was why they were struggling so much. So that then obviously fed into more anxiety symptoms, and there was that really cyclical link going on here.
That's really interesting. And if I think of, if young boys and men in particular are looking for this idea of what it means to be a man, and we know obviously it's generally the loudest voices that you'll see on social media, so like Andrew Tate's, and this kind of like hyper masculinity, sort of like misogynistic view of what it means to be a man. And if you're feeling like you're not living up to that, I can definitely see that playing into anxiety. I think another thing I took away from that was, if I think of myself as a parent, for example, I feel like I've got a great opportunity and almost a responsibility to show vulnerability and other things to my kids, to normalize it and make it seem okay to be able to feel like that. But even just as friends, or if you're in that, as you were saying, like another sort of more traditional role of maybe like a coach or a teacher, for example, where people are looking up to you as a role model, you have that opportunity to be able to demonstrate those behaviors yourself. And again, from other conversations that I've had with people, it seems like this word permission comes up a lot. Men need to feel like they've got permission to talk and to feel and to process those emotions. And so we've all kind of, I guess, got an opportunity to be able to demonstrate that and show that to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other research studies that I did was look at what the reasons for help seeking were in men. So for those who had sought help, what was the key drivers or pathways through to help services for them? And that's a really interesting and positive part of masculinity and masculinity's role in anxiety, was that there's a part of also utilizing and leveraging those norms around masculinity of strength, of resilience, of control, to look at help seeking in a positive way, or to look at dealing with those anxiety emotions in a positive way. So in that example of you with your son, it's a way of being able to sit with and normalize the emotional expression of anxiety or those symptoms of anxiety, but also show and hopefully model ways in which men themselves can manage and cope with those symptoms when they arise. And I think that that's hopefully a thing that we can encourage role models to do, but also be able to champion resources and even campaigns on social media or something to better show young men how to do that if they don't have male role models in their real life to display and encourage to help them in that journey.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost changing the perception of what strength means or what courage means. Is strength actually about suppressing things and trying to deal with things, or just ignore things, or is strength actually being able to talk about it and show other people the way as well, and almost be that leader? I think that's a really nice way of looking at it. Again, in the research, you talk about the fact that anxiety specifically can be considered a unique risk factor for male suicide. Why is that specifically?
Yeah. So that wasn't my primary research uncovering that insight. It was actually part of a review that I'd undertaken. So summarising work in the space of men's anxiety that had been done to synthesise where are we at currently, what do we know and what do we not know, where are the gaps. And so that was, again, some interesting research that came out of population-based data sets. So that had looked at a range of people, not just men, that had died by suicide and looked at their previous psychiatric diagnoses and then looked at what those unique risk factors were. So those two papers actually controlled for, as you mentioned, depression and psychosis, and then found that anxiety in itself was a risk factor for suicide fatalities, but also suicide attempts. And so there are a range of different reasons why that could be. It's definitely something that is requiring further and future research. I haven't done that yet, so it would only be speculation on my end. But when we look at really well-researched and empirically based conceptualizations of what happens through a suicide attempt or what can lead someone to engage in suicidal behaviours, we know that there are a range of different things that contribute to that. So there's a sense of loss of belonging, but there can also be a sense of an acquired capability to undertake, to act upon someone's suicidal ideations. And that can be increased potentially by anxiety symptoms or irritability, where it might not be an underlying sense of hopelessness or nihilism, but it could be an overwhelming sense of panic or a worry around what someone can do to respond to stresses in their lives. So I think, to me, it somewhat feels like a unique or a different, distinct emotional experience and a psychological experience that could be going on for people who are experiencing heightened suicidal distress, but it might be amplified by anxiety.
I want to make sure that we talk about practical steps that men, but also people in men's lives, can do to help manage anxiety. What are some effective steps or daily routines potentially that you've seen men take that have helped them manage and ultimately reduce their anxiety levels?
So part of it for a number of young men was being at a place or stage in their own mental health journeys that they felt like they could access mental health support. And that's important to preface the fact that not everyone does have access to mental health services or feels like that is an opportunity that's open or available to them. So I think it's important to say that that was a big part of what helped young men who I spoke to manage anxiety symptoms and their own anxiety experiences. But also what didn't surprise me but was very affirming to me was the number of them who spoke about just trying to implement day-to-day changes to stay on top of those symptoms before they reached a place in which they had to re-access mental health support or speak to their friends and family or something like that. So it was a number of, I guess, basic strategies that I feel like is so often talked about, yet sometimes the benefits of it are underestimated. It's things like sleeping well, eating well, exercise and moving your body when you can. A lot of the young guys spoke to me about the benefits of journaling, meditation, if they could, although some of them felt like it didn't necessarily help them at a point where their anxiety was already overwhelming. It can be something that they try to do as more of a daily grounding exercise before it gets to a point in which it felt unmanageable. And also the importance of socializing with friends, whether that be outside or through gaming, through online kind of spaces and platforms. It didn't necessarily have to be talking to them about their anxieties or the stresses that might be going on in their lives. Sometimes it was just the day-to-day interaction of doing something together, the collective doing, playing a game together. So it was actually more of a mode of being able to escape in a healthy way versus it necessarily having to be sit down conversations and dissecting the emotions or worries that were coming up for them.
That's definitely a big one for me, socializing and seeing friends and talking to friends. I think I often find in like just day to day life, I get stuck in almost like a silo. So if I'm in work, I just get so stuck in the moment of what might be going on in terms of like a project I'm working on or whatever it might be. And sometimes you just can't see the wood from the trees. And then just having a talk with someone that's completely removed from that situation, it just helps remind you that it's not all about that one thing. It's obviously like a life outside of that, but sometimes it's really hard to remember that. And also like as a parent as well, there's just so many challenges day to day with that. And again, just speaking with other people, but particularly other parents, and them going through the same thing, it just kind of alleviates some of that pressure. It doesn't always have to be very deep, meaningful conversations. It can just be just venting sometimes and just kind of like letting some of these emotions out, and then hearing other people going through the same thing, or even if they're not, just kind of changing the conversation and talking about something completely different just takes you out of that funk that you might have been just really kind of focusing on that one thing. So yeah, that personally, that
Exactly.
definitely helps for me.
To say anxiety does that as well. It can very much like the ruminating over worries and concerns. A big part of that is unfortunately sometimes isolating. That anxiety by virtue of it being about worries, about anxieties and stresses, it can then cut you off from feeling able and at capacity to socialize and engage with other people.
And then how can friends and family be better equipped, I guess, to support men who are going through a really tough time with anxiety? What are some of the things that they can do for the man in their life, but also to help them as well? Because I guess if you've got a friend or a partner that's really struggling with anxiety, that's tough on you too. So how can you sort of look after yourself at the same time as supporting someone as well?
That was a question that I asked the young men in the interviews as well. It was part of what I was really interested in is for those who had sought help through friends and family, what was helpful for them? What response that their family and friends gave them did they feel like benefited and helped them? And I think what was really interesting with that is that the majority of young men, I'm talking 80 or 90%, went to a mum, a sister, a female partner first, so that they often felt sometimes like it was easier or they were gravitating more towards the females in their life the first time that they were talking about their anxiety experiences. And that lines up with a lot of other work that we know around caregiving and help giving, that often it can fall sometimes on the shoulders or on the responsibility of women in certain family dynamics to be the main caregivers and help givers. So I don't necessarily think or see that as a negative. I think what I like to look at it as is an opportunity of how can we try to encourage spaces and places in all male friendship groups or in all male spaces to be more comfortable in expressing vulnerability or opening up spaces and opportunities where men who might be struggling feel more comfortable talking about it and disclosing it. So a big part of that could be thinking about ways that it might be an easier entry into checking in on someone if you're worried about it, or for the man who might be struggling with anxiety, thinking about how they might be comfortable or settings that they might be comfortable talking to their friends about it. So an example of that is a shoulder-to-shoulder activity. That can be a very practical, or I'm trying to give very tangible examples of how we might be able to open up and encourage those conversations. It's often, even I find, easier when you're driving in the car or walking with a friend to feel like those deep vulnerabilities kind of start to come out, versus when you're looking at someone eye to eye, it can feel maybe a little bit more stilted, or you're getting a very immediate reaction from somebody else to the things that you're saying. So the young guys were often saying that they felt most comfortable turning to or speaking to someone about anxiety who they knew had or experienced something similar themselves. So that speaks to the benefits of reciprocal help giving, that sometimes, as hard as it is to actually be the first one to bring up mental health in a conversations with your friends, if they've never said anything about it, I think you can hopefully feel as if by you sharing and starting to open up that conversation yourself, or take that big step and courageous step of talking about it for the first time, ultimately what that starts to do is create spaces that if your other friends are struggling, they then know or are more compelled to turn and talk to you about it. So yeah, I would say that's a big part of it. The more that we can open up conversations in friendships, the more likely somebody else is going to be to turn to someone and talk about it when they are struggling, that they know that there's someone who gets it, who they feel like isn't going to judge them for talking about it, and going to have hopefully or likely very practical examples from their own experience that they can pull from to respond to or suggest certain things that someone could do to look after themselves.
And is there any advice for partners or friends that have men that are going through serious anxiety to help them sort of look after themselves as well? Because, like I said, I guess that can be quite tough on them if they're trying to support someone that they really care about. That must be quite tough on them too.
Absolutely. A big part of why I gravitated so much to this space is that I had my own personal experiences supporting men in my life who were struggling. And a big challenge that I encountered was that I would look for the solutions for things to say. I would search for podcast episodes or articles of partners, sisters, daughters who were sharing their own experiences and things that they had learnt throughout their own journey of supporting a man in their life, so that I could try to do the same thing. I think so often you can feel or worry that you're getting it wrong, that you're saying the wrong thing, that you're not doing enough. But a big part of what I learned, and hopefully I try to encourage other women in men's lives, is that you don't have to have all the answers, especially with anxiety. Sometimes it might manifest as very set questions or specific issues that somebody might be dealing with or coming to you to talk about. But it's just the comfort and response that you can give someone that that's okay, that it will pass. I think as much as you can, just trying to be the non-judgmental, caring person in a man's life that can, if needed, help maybe direct them through to other mental health services, and knowing one's limits, especially as a partner, sister, a friend in a man's life. You're not the one who is going to be able to solve all of these mental health challenges for the man. That you shouldn't be that role anyway. But it's sometimes just being there is enough.
What's one really important thing related to anxiety in men that we haven't spoken about today that we really should have done?
Very good question. I would probably just like to emphasize a point that I made earlier on, that it isn't something that should be dismissed. I think I would like to give justice to the men's experiences that I've been able to capture in my research and the journeys that a lot of them have gone on to ultimately reckon with their anxiety and respond to it in healthier ways. So I would like to just re-emphasize and hopefully leave the listeners with that point, that if you are struggling yourself, that to be kind to yourself about the fact that it is a hard and sometimes long fought journey, but that there is very tangible and helpful solutions that are available to them, that this isn't a lifelong struggle. But when you are able to respond in a healthier way, you ultimately end up in a place of seeing anxiety as something that will come and go, but that you feel much more in control of.
Dr. Krista, thank you so much for your time today. This has felt like a really important conversation. Like we said, anecdotally, I've seen anxiety on the rise in my own circles, and I'm sure that's the case sort of wider afield as well. And I think it's about, as you were saying, recognizing that, yes, you will go through anxious periods in your life, but just making sure that it doesn't accelerate to something a little bit more serious. I think my personal takeaway, or my biggest takeaway, has been this opportunity that we have to be leaders, if you will, in terms of like sharing our emotions and showing how we're feeling. So you're giving other men permission to do the same thing. I think that's an incredible gift to be able to give men. And as we've said, sort of like rewriting the script of what strength is and what courage is. I don't personally believe it is about suppressing how you're feeling and not talking about it. I think it's actually completely opposite. I think it is actually being the first in your group, maybe, to actually vocalize that and give other men the opportunity and permission to do that. So that's definitely something I've really taken away. So thank you very much for your time today.
I completely agree. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk.